2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
University Professor of Politics Dr. Jim Joes in studio for our weekly dose of politics. Jim, hello and welcome.
Morning, Meryl.
It's been a really, really incredible night and day for the Australian stock market and international stock markets as we see China slow remarkably. And I couldn't help but thinking about this last night, Jim, thinking, what happens if we do have another global financial crisis? Did we spend all of the money in getting ourselves out of the last one? What will happen to us this time if it all goes south?
It is a scary thought to think that perhaps there's another GFC on the horizon. It's too early to sort of get into that sort of, shall we say, scaremongering mode, but it is something to be sort of wary about. And what will our government do, and what are its options? Did we spend all the money the last time around, and now we've got nothing left? No, I don't think so. Yes, certainly Kevin Rudd inherited a large surplus, which was basically money that the government had pulled out of the economy and stored up with the GFC at that time. He then had some reserves to work with. But even if those reserves are no longer of the same level that the Rudd government was able to use, the Abbott government is not hamstrung in what it can do. Basically, it can use various forms of financing to ensure that the Australian economy keeps ticking over. Now, what the Rudd government did was to keep spending happening so that as the downturn started to bite, the spending in the Australian economy kept going and kept the economy turning over and prevented it from sort of collapsing, shall we say, under the weight of the GFC. The principle was keeping the spending up, keeping the spending going. One might disagree with the particulars that the Rudd government came up with in order to do that.
The schools and bats and things.
Yes, we have to be mindful that there's a difference between the principle and the particulars in understanding whether a given particular was the right one at the time. As it happened, the activity was sufficient to keep the economy afloat. The Abbott government has a similar choice to make, although it's difficult to know whether it will make that choice. It's their sort of track record thus far has been very, very patchy in terms of the way it's handled the economy. I mean, when I think about the 2014 budget, the 2015 budget came down and wasn't anywhere near as severe or as disorganised, but it didn't add anything new by way of economic reform or ways in which they would manage the economy in the event of serious disruption. And that was surprising, given that the downturn in the resources industries, in the extractive industries, was well and truly looming. It wasn't simply off in the distance. It was very much, or it should have been very much, in the forefront of the government thinking. But there's been very little coming out of the government that suggests that it's taken that on board and that it is putting measures in place to address that. We've had a lot of talk from the Treasurer about bracket creep and income tax.
I was just going to raise that issue. Is that perhaps a tool that I'm sure Joe Hockey would argue would be a stimulant for the economy if people were to receive income tax breaks and in fact relieve that bracket creep where you earn more money, therefore pay more tax?
Well, there is a small gain to be made by having people having a bit more disposable income, but it's of marginal impact, unlike sort of stimulating the economy by the government investing in various areas and enabling private companies to keep afloat and to keep employing people who will then in turn have disposable income. That the idea that the tax breaks are going to be sufficient or a solution is, I think, very small scale thinking. And what's disappointing is that this has been an idea that Joe Hockey floats every sort of 6 months or so. Now, if he was really serious about this, we would have seen some action. Now, maybe that's to misunderstand what Joe Hockey is on about as Treasurer, but I think that simply floating the idea, which seems to happen on a fairly regular basis, but no serious action seems to follow from it, is sort of indicative of the way in which the government has operated in terms of its handling of economic reform and its handling of some of the key issues. We hear a lot, there's been a lot of focus on issues that are important in themselves, but in the scheme of the economic management and so forth, sort of pale into insignificance. So while sex equality and marriage, for example, is an important issue and so forth, against a looming financial crisis that is now in the wings, it's small change and something that the government needs to sort of say, okay, look, the vast majority of the Australian public seem to favour this. Let's get that out of the way, finalise that. Let's focus on the economy and economic management.
Parliament is, of course, currently in recess. I am supposing that if something were to break globally in the financial markets, then they, of course, would all be summoned back to Canberra to take action. Is that what normally would happen?
Sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
There would certainly be a cabinet meeting, and there would certainly be some high-level talks with the Prime Minister and senior ministers and their secretaries of departments. And if necessary, if emergency legislation was needed, then the Parliament could be recalled. But it would be more than likely that the Cabinet would come up with a particular line of policy and then try and implement it. The cautious approach, I guess, is for the government to sort of be ready and to avoid its sort of three-word slogans and its simplistic approach, and to start thinking about, you know, the sorts of long-term policies that would be needed to keep us afloat, which means investing in the economy rather than pulling money out of it and saying that, you know, we're responsible, we're not spending. That's probably the opposite of what would be needed, but exactly what they spend it on is another matter.
It's all a hypothetical at this stage, and here's hoping that it doesn't come to any of those things in terms of the financial woes of the world. Dr. Jim Jones, thank you so much for your time, and I'll catch up with you next Tuesday. Yes, here's hoping that we don't have a replication of the global financial crisis.